to join us. It's the one and only Duke the Dumpster. How are you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on your show.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. It's kind of it's an odd time at the moment for a lot of people with the lockdown and the restrictions. How are you kind of coping with that?
I'm doing all right. I mean, we've all been staying home for the most part, but part of my job, I have to go out and monitor people that are just out of jail that have GPS monitors and stuff. So every so often I have to go out and check on somebody to make sure they're doing the right thing. But other than that, we've all been kind of held up in the house. But we do get to go back to work tomorrow, which is good here in Tennessee. So.
Okay, so some progress is being made.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I wanted to go back to the very beginning, really, of your wrestling journey, which is where your love and your kind of passion for wrestling actually came from.
When I started, when I was growing up, I grew up in Miami, Florida. And I grew up on championship wrestling from Florida with Gordon Soley. Wrestlers like Dusty Rhodes and Ric Flair and Kevin Sullivan and Blackjack Mulligan and all these great wrestlers that came through there. And it was an NWA territory, and it ended up, of course, becoming part of WCW, all those wrestlers. But that's what I grew up watching. But the moment I knew I wanted to wrestle was at WrestleMania 1. They showed it by closed circuit television in arenas all across the world, I guess, and I know all across the country. But my dad took me to watch it at the Miami Beach Convention Center. We sat in an arena watching it on a big screen, and all the hype behind the Hulk Hogan, Mr. T, Roddy Piper, Paul Orndorff match is what got me. That's what made me say out loud that I wanted to become a professional wrestler.
And where was the next step on that journey? I assume it was training. So from where you lived at the time, did you go to like a local training school? How did you work your way up into actually, making it a career?
Well, I was still in high school at the time, and I was on the wrestling team actually. And at the end of our season, our wrestling team did a fundraiser. And the fundraiser was we brought professional wrestlers in to do a show. And those professional wrestlers were the people from Championship Wrestling from Florida. So we had like Barry Windham, Kendall Windham, Lex Luger, and all these people. They came to our gym and did a show to help us raise money for the wrestling team, and also so we could do our award ceremony for everybody on the team. Anyway, my dad went in the locker room and asked around about how somebody would go about learning to become a professional wrestler. And a guy there named Tyree Pride, the Haitian sensation, Tyree Pride was wrestling for Florida then. He had a friend that had a ring in a warehouse very close by in Opelika, Florida, which is only like maybe a half an hour from where I was. And he trained people. This guy's name was Bobby Wales, the Jamaican jammer, Bobby Wales. And he trained me, and I know he trained Norman Smiley, at least partially trained Norman Smiley. Norman Smiley was there learning when I was there. So, and then a bunch of other people. But it was just a ring in a warehouse. And I went down there religiously. Every night he gave me a key. So even when there was nobody there, I just rolled up a piece of carpet and jumped off the ropes and did moves on it, because that's how badly I wanted to do it.
And obviously a lot of us know you during your time in the WWE, WWF back then. So how did that actually come about? Can you tell us about the process? Did they approach you? Did you audition? How did that all come about?
Well, I was wrestling down in Florida part-time on the independent circuit as the garbage man, Rocco Gibraltar. And my plan was, when I finished college, to drive around the country and try to get a job. So I created a promotional package with a highlight video, a match. I did a resume. I did 8x10 pictures. And I made a bunch of them, like 30 or 40 of them. And I was going to drive around the country to different promotions, because there was still some regional promotions then. I was going to try to get a job. Then one day, before I went, I had just graduated from the University of Miami, and I was reading the newspaper, and it was talking about the steroid scandal in the WWF at the time, and how Hulk Hogan had moved over to WCW. And it talked about that whole thing. And then at the very end of the article, one sentence. It said that they were at a convention. First of all, they were at a convention there in Miami, Florida. It was called the NADP convention in the Miami Beach Convention Center, the same place I watched WrestleMania 1. They were having a convention of TV executives. And the last sentence of the article said, Vince McMahon, who was also in attendance, had no comment. And I realized right there at that moment, he was in my town. So I had to do something. And I didn't even give myself time to think. I was working at a beach club, members who owned homes on this beach, this island. Anyway, one of them was a TV executive at a local channel, Channel 2. I got his credentials. I wore a suit and I crashed the convention. I walked in like I was an executive, and I walked up to Vince McMahon at the WWF booth, and I started talking to him, and I introduced myself, and I handed him a promotional package, and he asked me a couple of questions, and then I got the hell out of there. And that's how I got in, because then J.J. Dillon called me about a week later.
Wow, so it's taking that chance and that bit of a risk that actually paid off for you.
And not giving myself a chance to think about it. I just did it.
And obviously, you mentioned there that you actually you did this in a prior promotion as the garbage man. So you actually came up with the gimmick of Duke the Dumpster.
Yeah, the gimmick was exactly the way it was in WWF, except they just changed the name so they could own the licensing. But I was the garbage man, Rocco Gibraltar. I wore the same coverall jumpsuit and carried a garbage can, and everything was the same.
So what was that like for you? You obviously mentioned the thing that inspired you was WrestleMania 1. So to actually be working for that company now and experience everything that goes with it, you know, the audience, the fame, the buzz, you know, what was it? How did it feel to actually be part of that now?
It was crazy. I remember, I was just talking about this today. One of my most memorable moments in the business, like the first few months that I was in the WWF, you know, I was still a fan. I mean, yes, I was in the business, but I was still a fan of a lot of these guys that all of a sudden I was in a locker room with. And it was an interesting transition to get past that, you know, and go into wrestler mode and not fan mode anymore, because, you know, we had a job to do. But it was really strange standing in a locker room with guys like Bret Hart and Lex Luger and Shawn Michaels and all these guys that, you know, as I was coming up in Florida, I was watching these guys on TV. So it was shocking and it was strange, but it was awesome.
What was Shawn Michaels like as a person? Did you have any dealings with Shawn? What was he like backstage?
Back then, and by his own admission, back then Shawn was pretty arrogant. But he was ruthlessly trying to get that top position, which he deserved at the time. But he was positioning himself to be the champion because that's what he wanted. And to that end, he at times could be pretty crappy to people. I got along with him because I knew what he was all about. I understood what he was doing and why he did it. I got along with all those guys. But Shawn did rub a lot of people the wrong way, and a lot of people hated him. But, you know, I didn't really care. As long as he didn't ever do anything to cross me, I didn't have a problem with it. And
the time that you were there was kind of a crazy time for the WWF, because you had a lot of their superstars jumping ship over to WCW. So was there any tensions? Did you pick up on it? Because it must have been such a crazy time, because they were losing superstar after superstar going over to the rivals. So was it a kind of a tense period?
You never really heard anything much from the office about it. When they started Nitro, it was interesting because you remember the first Nitro, they brought out Lex Luger, and it was a shock because he was supposed to be negotiating with the WWF and he just left. And so the boys were all talking about it, but not the office. So then it was interesting when that Nitro started, the first probably month, maybe 2 months, we still beat Nitro in the ratings. And it was interesting because I remember Bruce Pritchard coming in the locker room after each Monday Nitro and Monday Night Raw, and he said, we got to hire rating than they did. They did this, we did a higher number. They did this, we did a, and he did that for a few times, and then all of a sudden he stopped coming in there and telling us because they started kicking our ass. And it was just interesting to see people's demeanor, and it was a really rough time. You know, it was that transition before Vince was willing to take off the gloves, as he put it, and really change the product. So we were holding on to the old school mentality of family entertainment, and it was difficult. So yeah, it was just interesting that, you know, first the office was happy because we seemed to be beating him, but then it changed really quick. And yeah, a lot of people were jumping ship.
I mean, I've been talking to a lot of wrestlers over the last couple of weeks, and a lot of them have wrestled for promotions like ECW, and we were talking about the hardcore kind of side of wrestling. But I know you actually introduced us in an odd way to hardcore, because there was an incident where, was it you and Jerry the King Lawler, and it involved the trash can, and that caused some kind of, you know, ruffled feathers backstage. So talk us through what actually happened and what the kind of reaction was like backstage to the incident.
And that's exactly right. It was the first issue I had when I got there. The first feud they were putting me in was with Jerry the King Lawler. On my debut match on Superstars, I walked out, and Jerry Lawler was standing there like he was going to interview me, and he put a clothespin on his nose to act like I stunk, you know, to embarrass me, and I dumped a can of garbage all over his head. So then, fast forward to the next Monday Night Raw, and he had me on the King's Court, which was on a live Raw. And we were supposed to do a deal where I came out and he was going to interview me, but he wouldn't let me get in the ring. And I tried to talk a couple times, and he cut me off. And finally, I had enough. And I said, I'm leaving. I don't want to be here anyway, whatever. So I was turning to walk away, and he was going to attack me. Well, in the back, we talked about it. He asked me, he said, you think it'd be all right if we did something like I hit you with your own garbage can? I told him, I said, that'd be fine, you know, because I knew it would be heat. Because up until that point, I don't think anybody in that, you know, in the WWF had seen anything like that. So we went and asked Jack Lanza, who was the agent for that segment. And I'll never forget it. You know, he didn't go ask anybody. He just looked at us and he said, screw it. It's live TV. Just do it. So I was like, okay. I mean, I don't think anything of it. So we went out and did it. And if you watch the tape of it on YouTube, he attacks me. And as soon as he hits me with that garbage can, they cut the camera angle all the way back to a far camera across the arena where you can't see up close where he's hitting me with it, because they freaked out. It was deemed too violent for their product at the time. They did not want anything like that. So then they immediately put Gorilla Monsoon and Randy Macho Man Savage, who were doing the commentary, on TV to apologize for what had just happened and promise you would never see that again in the WWF. So that basically killed it right there. And then on top of that, like the next week on Superstars, they had a pre-taped segment where they made Jerry the King Lawler come out and apologize. And it was kind of funny. It was like comedy, but it just killed all the heat for the angle. Yeah. And yeah, when we got on Raw, when we got back to the back, they were freaking out. And I remember Shane McMahon came running up to me and he goes, what happened? I said, they said they wanted to do it. And I agreed. I thought it would be good. And they were just like, oh, no, you can't do that. He just kept saying, you can't do that on this TV. So that's how it happened. And that's how they squashed it. And then they wouldn't let anybody do anything like that again for a long time. And then, of course, after I left, they started doing dumpster matches and hardcore matches and everything else. So.
Was that frustrating for you? Because, you know, after you've left and you're kind of looking and think, really, you know, I've been told I can't do this, and now it's a regular thing within the company. But was part of you a little bit annoyed? Because I guess for you, you could have really demonstrated a lot more if you had the chance to do those type of matches.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I mean, I definitely would have. It would have been different. I was a little bit annoyed, I guess, especially when they actually called a match the dumpster match that they had with New Age Outlaws and Mick Foley and Terry Funk. That kind of annoyed me, but I wasn't there. It is what it is. But yeah, you could see it. When I was still there, we didn't pay much attention to ECW. We thought it was garbage. We're like, these guys are out there killing themselves for nothing. But lo and behold, as time moved on and everybody started trying to become more shocking, WWE and WCW started bringing in hardcore matches and hardcore wrestlers, and it just changed everything. So, yeah, I mean, I definitely would have been in the middle of all that.
And obviously, we've got to talk about another feud that you had, which is probably one of your most popular, would have been that with Triple H. So what was it like working with Triple H? Did you guys have did you feel you had a good chemistry?
Yeah, we worked together a lot building up to that. It was, it was kind of interesting. It was right before I had my new contract was coming up. The original deal was 2 years, and then you kind of roll over for a new year if you want to stay there. But at that time, I wasn't too happy. They weren't doing much with me after the first 2 years, and I kind of complained. So what they did is, they wanted to roll me over on the contract. So they gave me the Triple H angle to kind of pacify me and make me happy. But I knew I wasn't going to win in the end because he was basically, politically speaking, he was part of the clique. And I really didn't care about that. I was glad to finally be on a pay-per-view because up to that point, I had no singles matches on any pay-per-views. The only pay-per-view I had done up to that point was Royal Rumble. So I was happy. At that point, I was wanting to turn heel, and I wanted to change my appearance and change some things. So we decided, and this was Jim Ross's suggestion. I was sitting with Vince and Jim Ross talking about turning heel. And Jim Ross said, well, why don't we make cutting your hair part of the angle with Triple H, which I agreed to. I said, that's fine. As long as I get some kind of payback, in the end, I don't have to beat him or I don't have to cut his hair, but as long as I get some kind of payback. And it was like, yeah, of course. So I agreed to it, and we did this whole thing, and we wrestled in a bunch of house shows building up to that In Your House. Well, first we did that free-for-all to determine who wrestled in the Rumble number 1 and number 30. And I beat him by disqualification, of course, because Lord knows they weren't going to let me pin him. And so he had to go in number 1, and I went in number 30. So that was the catalyst for him getting pissed off and attacking me on Superstars and cutting my hair off. And that created the angle. So we just kind of built it up and went to that In Your House pay-per-view. They were just starting those In Your House pay-per-views at the time. And we wrestled a lot. Triple H was always excellent to work with. I didn't exactly like the clique and all them and the power that they had. But in terms of, being a professional, Triple H was awesome. And he was awesome to work with. He was willing to do anything. Lord knows he took every bump I gave him. I threw him all over the place. I mean, I press slammed him, power slammed him, spine busted him. I did everything. And he took it and never complained. So I have to give it to him. He took some bumps. So he was great to work with.
And you mentioned there that, the clique had a lot of power. Who would you say that power was over? Would it be people like Vince McMahon? Did they have the kind of creative, could they say, I want to do this? Could they basically get whatever they wanted?
Well, you could tell that Shawn Michaels had Vince's ear. Like Vince listened to Shawn Michaels. You could tell whatever the reason was. Now, I remember hearing a shoot interview where Kevin Nash said they kind of banded together and compared paychecks on a certain pay-per-view and realized Vince was paying people differently. And they complained. And that was what kind of set up the clique to have power, because they let the office know that they were talking amongst themselves about pay. So I think Vince let them get away with things and gave them a certain amount of power to contain that potential problem. He didn't want like everybody comparing notes and comparing paychecks. So that's possibly what happened. I mean, that's the way I heard it. I'm not sure, but it was very obvious that Shawn and then later Kevin Nash and that whole group had power with Vince.
And do you think a part of it could have been a fear of losing such big superstars, because they had lost a lot of people, and it's fair to say Triple H and Shawn Michaels were, the future of the company. So do you think it could have been a little bit of fear that he doesn't want them to jump ship?
I think that could be part of it, but I also think that he was being loyal to Shawn, because Shawn was loyal to him for so long, and Shawn worked his way up through the ranks for quite a while, and he was showing loyalty back to Shawn, I think, which is understandable.
And if I was to ask you now, what was your big highlight for your time in the WWE? What would you say it is? Is there something that stands out as something that you'll never forget and was kind of a special moment?
Well, I would have to say going back for WrestleMania 17, even though I wasn't working there anymore, I went back for that gimmick battle royal. That was amazing to walk out in front of 65,000 people in the Astrodome. We weren't drawing crowds like that back in the mid 90s. So it was insane. That was cool. And then just, working with Triple H, that whole thing was great too.
So why did you leave the WWE? What happened with that? Was it your choice to leave? Did your contract expire?
I had just rolled over into that new year, and I had that feud with Triple H, and I had to lose to him in your house, and he basically grabbed the garbage can lid and hit me with it. It was a fuck finish, and I didn't like it. I was, like I had said before, I wanted to get some kind of payback. So they kind of ended it there. And then Triple H went to WrestleMania and did that job for the Ultimate Warrior in 12 seconds. And then Triple H jumped to Mark Marrow, who was brand new and coming in. But me, they just turned me right back to putting over any new heels on TV. So they got me to roll over and sign my new year, and then they put me right back to what I was doing before. And I was unhappy about that. And I was complaining about it. I was getting pissed off, and I was doing drugs and drinking a lot of alcohol, and all these things together. I was, becoming erratic, and I was just not in my right mind. I was complaining to Vince a lot. And then finally Vince had enough, and he just sent me home. He sent Jerry Briscoe to come talk to me and said, Vince said you could just go on home. So they sent me home, and I still had like 8 months on that contract, and I just went and sat home. I was so pissed off and just depressed about the whole thing. So that's how I ended up leaving.
So what happened with the remaining time of your contract? Did you just not do anything else with that? Did they still pay you?
Well, the thing about it is those contracts in those days, the only guarantee was $150 a match for 10 matches, which is $1,500. And they had, by that time, easily reached that and surpassed it in those, Triple H matches and the pay-per-view I had so far that year. They were way beyond that. So they didn't have to pay me anything else, and they didn't. So I just went and sat home, and I was done. A little bit later, I would try to go once my contract was up. I went and wrestled over in Germany for a while. When I got back from that, I went and tried out for WCW, but I still wasn't in my right mind, and the tryout didn't go too well, and it just didn't work out. So,
I mean, for you, someone who's obviously passionate about the business, and you've worked hard, you've given it your all to create a really exciting storyline, and just when you thought you were kind of getting somewhere, and you even said, look, I'm willing to adapt, just give me the opportunity to show it. Did you have any kind of ill feelings or animosity towards Vince McMahon for the way he handled that, rather than coming to talk to you yourself and hear your frustrations, to just send someone to send you home? Did that cause any ill feelings on your part?
Well, I had ill feelings then. Because I didn't understand how things work. I expected Vince to make a promise to me and keep it. He makes promises to a lot of people, but he falls back on a lot of those promises because things change. I remember the story of King Kong Bundy when he came back in like 96 or whatever, 95. And Vince promised him the heel push of a lifetime. He's like, we're going to put you over strong and make you this and that. And then, and immediately Bundy just fizzled out and he went to doing nonsense matches and he was frustrated about it. And Vince just looked at him and said, it just didn't happen, you know, and that was his explanation. Sometimes things just don't happen or they don't work. Vince has an idea, and if you walk out and don't execute the way he wants you to exactly, a lot of times he'll lose interest and it falls apart and he pushes that aside and he moves on to the next thing. And that's how that business works. And if you're not prepared for that and how to deal with that, then you're not going to make it. And at that time, I didn't know how to deal with it. You know, it's dealing with letdowns and frustrations and broken promises. That's part of it. You got to know how to handle that. And you got to know how to talk to promoters. I didn't know how to do that stuff. I just thought me being there with my ability in the ring and all my merits as a wrestler was enough. Well, it's not enough. You got to know how to play the game backstage. So that was the lesson I learned. So speaking now, I look back and people often ask me about what kind of person Vince McMahon is or was. And I just always say he's a shrewd businessman. He does what he has to do to make that a successful company. And unfortunately, especially back in those days, he had to step on a lot of toes and crush a lot of people's dreams and break a lot of promises. That was part of it. And it was just a different time. And he had to do what he had to do to survive as a company. So, I mean, I can't hold nothing against him for it. It's just the way he had to run his business.
And you mentioned a little earlier in the interview that one of your highlights was, of course, the gimmick battle royal. So when they came to you and said, look, we want you to be part of this, was that kind of for you? Like, you know, I'm getting an opportunity now to experience the WWE on a bigger scale, because like you said yourself, you know, the audiences were bigger. The production was a lot better. So for you, did it feel like a second chance, even though it was a one-off?
I'm sure in my head, I somehow thought it was a second chance, but at that time, I was not in a good place. I was in Florida. I was working for an independent down in Florida. I had a wrestling ring and I was training some people and I was wrestling. I was setting up the ring for the show. I was wrestling in these shows. But I was doing a lot of drugs. I was messed up. I was in no condition to work anywhere full time. And they didn't call me. I called them. I remember a wrestler down in Florida saying, they're having some kind of gimmick battle royal, man. You need to call them. So I called Bruce Pritchard and he acted like they had been looking for me. He was like, oh, where have you been? I was like, yeah, whatever. And they let me be in it, which I was glad. But I was really in no condition to wrestle. That's why I kind of, you know, begrudgingly say that was my greatest moment, because I wasn't all there. But no, I knew it wasn't going to be a second chance because I was in no condition to wrestle full time at that point. If you really look at me when I come out the curtain at WrestleMania, I'm really skinny and out of shape, and I don't look very good because I was a mess. So that was the actual experience behind the scenes.
And going there, obviously, there was a whole host of new superstars. When you went there, did you kind of talk to any of those people? Did you share any moments with some of your older friends? Did you even speak to Vince back then?
I said hi to Vince and Shane. You know, I talked to quite a few of the wrestlers. I talked to Austin a little bit, but you could tell things had changed for him at that point. He had a lot of different worries from when I was there with him before. Now he was the guy, so he had to look at it from that standpoint. It was interesting sitting in the back in the locker room and talking to guys like, they had this guy Brackus, this German, and Mark Henry was there, and they were telling me how the office had them watching tapes of me to teach them how to do certain moves like power slams and stuff. I was shocked. I was flattered actually that they were using tapes of me doing power moves to teach these big guys how to do it when they were training them. So that was always interesting. But I stayed away from guys a lot there at WrestleMania because I was kind of embarrassed about the shape I was in. So for the most part, I kind of stayed away from people. I talked to a few of the old friends, but then just kept to myself.
And do you have anything to do with the company now? Is there anyone that you still speak to? Have you ever been contacted to do new things? Do you still receive any kind of support from the WWE?
Every once in a while, I'll get a quarterly royalty check of a few dollars for somebody else's videos that I accidentally appeared in or something, but it's not much. I'm not in contact with the office, but I do talk to some of the wrestlers. Well, not current wrestlers. I've talked to Austin a few times lately here, and I was on his podcast last year. Sometimes I'll talk to guys on social media like Savio or Fred Ottman. He was Typhoon or Tugboat. Sometimes I'll talk to Carl Ouellette. He's wrestling as PCO now. A lot of these guys I'm still kind of friends with. I mean, I kind of came back from nowhere. I disappeared for a long time. And I didn't want to come back in any capacity. And then something happened in 2018. I went and finally begrudgingly went and did an autograph signing at a show. And people started getting in touch with me on social media. And it just kind of opened up this whole thing where I started telling stories on Facebook and interacting with fans, and it kind of brought me back to the part of the business that I always enjoyed, which was, interacting with fans and telling stories and doing funny stuff. And that's kind of what I'm doing now. But as far as the office itself, WWE, no, I don't have any kind of business with them or anything like that.
Are you glad that you're kind of back now, going to that autograph signing and actually being part of the nostalgia, people wanting to meet their childhood heroes? And I know the other day, actually, on social media, you had a really nice message from a young fan who wasn't even alive when you were wrestling, but he sent you the nicest message that he had watched your matches. How does that feel for you to still have people, new generations, watching and admiring your work?
Absolutely amazing. It's absolutely amazing. There's been this resurgence, it seems, lately of people looking back and remembering the golden era of wrestling and all the way through to the time I was there in the new generation before the Attitude Era. People are looking back, even though it was goofy characters and all that, people are looking back fondly at those years and collecting things. And I'm getting booked to do appearances now and do autographs and meet fans. And so it's really been fun. And yeah, that message from that kid, that threw me for a loop. A little 12-year-old was like home during quarantine and he was watching old Duke the Dumpster matches on the network. So that stuff's really cool to me. That's the stuff I always loved, with all the bad stuff behind the scenes that I hated about the wrestling business. This is the stuff that I love, and I'm glad and enjoying the fact that I can do this stuff now and interact with people and have some fun in this business and not be worried about looking over my shoulder at who's trying to stab me in the back anymore. It's just fun interacting with the fan.
I think what was really nice and humble, because you wouldn't get it with a lot of people, is you actually replied and said that you were willing to send him a signed photo or a card. And I thought that was really nice because not a lot of people would have, one, responded, but two, actually go out of their way to send them a little gift.
I try to respond to everybody. And I do pretty much respond to everybody. I mean, every once in a while you get some crazies out there that, push it a little bit. But no, for the most part, everybody's really cool. And I respond to everybody. I talk to people on Messenger all the time if I have time. But yeah, it's not uncommon. I was so taken back by his, the words and the what he was saying. Of course, I'm gonna send him. And he said he hoped he could meet me and someday get an autograph. Man, of course I'm gonna send him an autograph. You know, I hope younger fans want to come back and watch the old stuff and get into the old wrestlers like me and all those guys that wrestled back then. So, yeah, I was more than happy, and I try to always respond to people that message me and want to talk.
Well, Mike, honestly, I'm so pleased that you've given me your time today to actually just go through your career and, you know, for you to be so open and honest as well, because, I mean, there's such a difference between, because you left and then the Attitude Era kind of started a year later, and it was kind of a different world. You can watch the network now and you put on a pay-per-view from 96 to 97, and then you put on 98, and it's like a completely different company. I mean, would you have liked to have been there in the Attitude Era? Do you think you could have really have got the chance to showcase your talent?
For a long time, I regretted the fact that I left right before the Attitude Era. A lot of times people ask me if I regretted it. I did for a long time, but I look at it this way, and this is the truth. During that time, a large part of the reason I left was because I was doing a lot of drugs. I had a bad drug problem, painkillers and other stuff. And about a year after I left, they stopped drug testing the wrestlers. Savio Vega, I remember, called me and he said, they're not drug testing anymore. They said it's too expensive. And I was like, I remember thinking, I was just like, uh-oh. You know, I was home and I was on drugs and I was messed up, but I was just like, uh-oh. And that's when all the wrestlers started dying. So the reality is, if I was still there when the Attitude Era took off and they quit drug testing, I would probably be one of the dead wrestlers, more than likely, because that's how hard I was going. I mean, I didn't have a wife or kids at home, so I was going hard on the road, and then I would go just as hard when I got home. So, you know, chances are I would be a statistic, and I have to look at it that way. That's the reality. Could I possibly made a lot of money? Yeah, I probably could have and been more famous, but you know, there's also a very high likelihood I ended up one of the dead guys. So, you know, that's the way I got to look at it.
Well, thankfully, you know, you're still here to get to talk to different people. And what's your life like now? I mean, what kind of things do you do now? It looks like you've got a nice house and, you know, you're happy.
I am. Things are going well. I work here. I work for a drug court program, which is a program that helps people that have substance abuse problems. They get arrested for things, and instead of just locking them up and throwing away the key, we bring them out under very strict supervision, and we try to give them help with their problems and teach them how to live life without drugs and stuff. At one point, I actually went through this drug court program because I got into trouble several years ago when I finally came out of the drug haze for the last time. And now I work for them, and I use my experience to try to help folks get through it and change their lives. So that's what I'm doing now.
Honestly, thank you so much for joining us. And it's just so nice to hear that you've battled, you know, you've come through all these demons yourself, and now you're using your own personal experiences to kind of give back to other people and kind of say, look, you know, there is a way past this. I've been there, I've done that, and look at me. So honestly, I think it's inspirational what you're doing. And I'm so grateful that you've joined us today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.